Dicen que en la plaza en estos días se les ha visto cabalgar a Camilo y a Martí. Y delante de la caravana, lentamente sin jinete, un caballo para ti.
Vuelven las heridas que nos sanan de los hombres y mujeres que no te dejaremos ir. Hoy el corazón nos late afuera y tu pueblo, aunque le duela, no te quiere despedir.
Hombre, los agradecidos te acompañan. Como anhelaremos tus hazañas, ni la muerte cree que se apoderó de ti. Hombre, aprendimos a saberte eterno, así como lo vi Jesucristo. No hay un solo altar sin una luz por ti.
Hoy no quiero decirte, comandante, ni barbudo ni gigante, todo lo que sé de ti. Hoy quiero gritarte, Padre mío, no te sueltes de mi mano, aún no sé andar bien sin ti.
Hombre, los agradecidos te acompañan, como anhelaremos tus hazañas, ni la muerte cree que se apoderó de ti. Hombre, aprendimos a saberte eterno, así como lo vi Jesucristo. No hay un solo altar sin una luz por ti. Hombre, los agradecidos te acompañan, como anhelaremos tus hazañas, ni la muerte cree que se apoderó de ti. Hombre, aprendimos a saberte eterno, así como lo vi Jesucristo. No hay un solo altar sin una luz por ti.
Dicen que en la plaza esta mañana ya no caben más corceles llegando de otro confín. Una multitud desesperada de héroes de espaldas aladas que se han dado cita aquí. Y delante de la caravana, lentamente sin jinete, un caballo para ti.
Porque lo tenían todo planeado y la historia se conoce perfectamente bien. Desde hace muchos años los imperialistas, cuando sabían que algún día esas colonias se liberarían, empezaron a organizar sus movimientos. Cabinda tiene grandes recursos petroleros. Esa es una de las razones por las que los imperialistas quieren apoderarse de Angola. Y así organizaron el FLNA con gente de la CIA Algunos imperialistas se preguntan ¿por qué ayudamos a los angoleños? ¿Qué intereses tenemos nosotros allí? Ellos están acostumbrados a pensar que cuando un país hace algo es porque está buscando petróleo, o cobre, o diamante, o algún recurso natural. No. Nosotros no buscamos ningún interés material y los imperialistas es lógico que no lo entiendan. Porque se guían por criterios exclusivamente chauvinistas, nacionalistas, egoístas. Estamos cumpliendo un elemental deber internacionalista cuando ayudamos al pueblo de Angola.
Greetings, everybody. Welcome to the Revolution with the Revolution podcast. My name is Onya Sanu. I am one of your hosts alongside with my comrade Ermia, who is here today. You're going to see her soon. We do this show every single Friday, or most Fridays, I'll say most Fridays, at 1 p.m. Eastern, where we cover the latest updates in the U.S. war against the Cuban people, where we talk about history, where we give political education, where we share updates on what's happening in our home organization, the National Network on Cuba. So thank you so much for tuning in. Please hit that like button. Please share the YouTube link. Help us build our audience. Help us build alternative, anti-imperialist, revolutionary, feminist, queer platforms to spread the news. Because man, I was watching CBS news this morning on Pluto TV. They had the 24-hour CBS News live stream, and they really just talk about bullshit and lie about the bullshit as they're talking about it. Just hot garbage, nonsense. Love Island, the World Cup, Trump talking about China interfering in elections with no critical thinking whatsoever, just presenting the ruling class narrative straight up. No wonder people living in the US are so confused. We desperately need alternative media, and that is what we are trying to do with Revolution within the Revolution. So please support us. So we always start off every show expressing our unconditional solidarity with the Bolivarian Revolution, the people of Venezuela. Venezuela has been a key friend of the Cuban Revolution for a very long time, up until the point earlier this year on January 3rd, I believe, when the U.S. military invaded Venezuela, killed 100 people, including dozens of Cubans who died fighting for the Bolivarian Revolution, and then kidnapped Nicolas Maduro, the democratically elected president, and Celia Flores, the first lady. They have been held on made-up charges in solitary detention in the Manhattan Detention Center. Since that day, they have been denied access to their guaranteed right to a defense of from the charges against them, which are again made up. And at the same time as this is happening, we have seen Venezuela essentially become a colony of the United States. Marco Rubio is running it like his own personal fiefdom. And against that backdrop of U.S. intervention, of murder, of invasion, of occupation and colonization now, Venezuela then suffered a massive earthquake a couple of weeks ago. The death toll is rising constantly. It's over 2,000 people dead now. And this is a nation that, in addition to the U.S. invasion, in addition to the kidnapping of its democratically elected leadership, in addition to having to deal with Marco Rubio's colonial control, this nation has also been suffering under a maximum pressure campaign carried out by the United States under bipartisan direction. Both Democratic and Republican administrations have carried out a campaign of economic war against Venezuela, of propaganda war against Venezuela, demonizing it, sanctioning it, starving the people. And so this has been happening for years. Then the invasion happens, then the earthquake happens. And so understand that this death toll is on the hands of US imperialism, period. This nation has not been allowed to freely develop. It has been constantly fighting for its survival against nonsense, against imperialism, seeking to reconquer it, seeking to control its oil supply. And so, yeah, this earthquake was not a natural disaster. This earthquake and the death toll from it is the consequence of U.S. intervention. And Venezuela cannot even properly recover because of the economic sanctions that have intentionally destroyed its economy, and also because it's been straight up looted, not just by the United States, but by multiple imperialist nations. There is currently $1.6 billion of Venezuela's money. It's like straight up stolen from Venezuela in the Bank of England. And people have been like, hey, they just had an earthquake. Multiple cities have been destroyed. A lot of people are dead. They need help recovering. Y'all are talking about sending troops. Why don't you give them their money back so they could use that to recover? And thus far, the Bank of England's like, who, us? What do you mean? Just straight up looting and barbarism. So solidarity with the people of Venezuela. Free Nicolas Maduro and Celia Flores. Unsanctioned Venezuela, period. End the economic attacks. If you can fix your mouth to criticize Delcy Rodriguez, you can certainly fix your mouth to say that US and UN and UK sanctions against Venezuela need to end. The Bank of England needs to give their money back, period, because they are exacerbating, once again, man-made disaster caused by US imperialism. Moving on to the This Day in Cuban History segment that we always do at the top of the show. We have a couple of significant historical events that we want to highlight today. First and foremost is the surrender of Spanish forces to the U.S. Navy on July 17th, 1898, producing the end of the so-called Spanish-American War. And it's celebrated as it's celebrated in imperialist circles, ruling class circles, as the day that the U.S. won Cuba's independence. You should know, if you've been watching the show or you have any sense whatsoever, you should know off top that that's bullshit. What it actually was, first of all, the Cuban independence movement had been fighting against Spanish colonization for hundreds of years at that point. They have been molly-whopping Spanish ass all across the island for decades at that point. And then the U.S., what the U.S. did on July 17th, 1898, is that the Spanish fleet was running away. They were trying to flee the Caribbean. The U.S. Navy had better ships, and so they went after the Spanish fleet. And as the Spanish fleet was running away, the U.S. Navy sank every ship. And then Spain was like, well, damn, and surrendered. And then Spain and the U.S., behind the backs of the Cuban, not just actually the Cuban independence movement, but also national liberation movements that were happening in Puerto Rico and Philippines at the same time, usurping all those three different national liberation struggles. The U.S. and Spain negotiated the Treaty of Paris, which handed over control of Puerto Rico, Cuba, and the Philippines to the U.S., making the U.S. empire the new colonizers of those nations that had been fighting for their national liberation against Spain this whole time. And I just want to go back to the story. Like, the U.S. ran after the Spanish fleet and sank it. What does that sound like to you? Does that sound like how U.S. police officers and ICE agents and federal agents act all the time? Because it does to me. How many videos have you seen of armed agents of the U.S. government shooting and murdering fleeing people? It is a key tactic of U.S. violence. Let me tell you. And then they write the story like they were the heroes, like they were in fear of their life, like they were liberating Cuba. Oh my God. Anyway, so that was July 17th, 1898, the surrender of Spanish forces to the U.S. Navy at the Battle of Santiago, aka the U.S. running after a fleeing entity and sinking all their ships, and then going behind the back of the people who actually won Cuba's independence to negotiate with the Spanish, whose boats they sank. So yeah, the other significant historical event that happened today was tomorrow. On July 18th, 1959, Fidel Castro resigned as prime minister of Cuba. He resigned at one point over political differences with the first provisional president of the republic after the victory of the Cuban Revolution. That man's name was President Manuel Urrutia Leo. And some context about Fidel's resignation, temporary resignation, is that both Castro and Urrutia had fought in the resistance to Batista. Obviously, Fidel was in an armed struggle from jump, July 26th, or the attack on the Moncada garrison, then the July 26th movement, and then the victory of the military victory over Batista's government carried out by the guerrilla warfare that Fidel and Che led. So Fidel was like in the trenches, and Urrutia was like more so in the civil resistance to Batista, but they were both in the resistance to Batista. However, when they won, Urrutia emerged as like a figure that could serve as the first official president of the revolutionary government. He actually had the support of both the United States and forces within the July 26 movement. However, only a couple of months in, there was clear ideological differences over the question of communism. Urrutia was very anti-communist. He was very anti-communist. He was fully from that petty B. He was like, okay, I'm okay with like getting out the dictator. But what do you mean I have to cut my pay? What do you mean we're trying to nationalize land and industries? I don't know about all this. I am trying to benefit from this new state of affairs. And if we engage in class warfare, that is going to hurt my interests. And so he declared on national television that communism was a threat to the Cuban Revolution and said that true revolutionaries should organize to oppose communism. Fidel Castro at this time said that he was not a communist. He was also not a capitalist. He was pursuing a third way between communism and capitalism. And this is like not, like that was a common position at the time. Like if you are familiar with Kwame Nkrumah, who was the first president of Ghana, after Ghana gained independence from British colonialism, like fought an anti-imperialist and class struggle and pushed out the British and formed an independent government. Like at that time, Nkrumah was saying the same thing. And multiple national liberation leaders in the global South were saying the same thing. Also, most of those leaders later emerged as straight up communists, including Castro. But this was the wave at the time saying, hey, we're not picking a side. We're doing our own thing. It was also referred to as like the non-aligned movement at times, like not the US, not the USSR, in the middle. We don't want a part of your beef. That's essentially what he's trying to say. But he was also like, we are not going to be manipulated into being anti-communist. Absolutely not. That's not a third way. That's picking a side. And so Urrutia's position was very controversial. In addition to these ideological differences over communism, he was also increasingly hostile to the objectives of the revolution. Again, the nationalizing of land and resources. Also, there was like a new law passed that called for his personal income to be reduced. When he took the position, he made the same salary annually as Batista. And people were like, that's not going to work. And he was like, what do you mean? What do you mean my money? So yeah, they had differences. And then this came to a head when the leader of the Sugar Workers Union demanded Urrutia's resignation. And then shortly afterwards, Castro resigned as prime minister of Cuba in protest of Urrutia's, like, how do I want to put it? Obstructivism when it came to the development of the revolution and a progressive direction. And then Fidel made a televised speech denouncing Urrutia. The masses of Cuban workers were with it. They were like, we want class struggle. We've already lived under the rule of the bourgeois and the petty bourgeois, and that shit sucked. And so we would like a class struggle, please. And so they largely backed the Sugar Workers Union as well as Fidel and surrounded the presidential palace, demanding Urrutia's resignation. He, of course, complied. He was outnumbered. Castro resumed his position as the prime minister, and then a new provisional president came in whose name was Osvaldo Dorticos, and that is a story for another day. But so this day in history in 1959, or rather tomorrow in history in 1959, marks a decisive point in the development of the Cuban Revolution as an anti-capitalist project, as a socialist and communist project, because they had to wage this internal struggle and pick a side, essentially. It was valid to be not aligned, but at the end of the day, we need socialism, we need communism, and Fidel was clear. So yeah, that's what happened this day in history. Later on the show today, we are going to be doing another excerpt from the Brigadista Prep for the centenary of Fidel Brigade. We're going to be talking about internationalism as an intentional strategy of the Cuban Revolution. Cuba does not just send doctors and soldiers and teachers all over the world because it's like morally correct to do so. They are also doing it because Cuba recognizes that the global struggle against imperialism is connected. A victory against imperialism anywhere in the world, whether it's in Turtle Island or Africa or Asia, represents a victory against imperialism for the entire global movement. So they have, without question, put their resources where their ideology lines. They have aligned words and action, you know what I'm saying? They have acted in integrity by supporting people's struggles all over the world. And it has strengthened the Cuban Revolution as a project. And me and Armia are going to break down precisely how. But before we get to that, we want to share some updates in the No War on Cuba campaign, still ongoing. We have seen more escalation of the U.S. attacks on the Cuban people. So let's get into it. And I'm going to use the wonders of technology, to put up this slide depicting a screenshot from an article. Can I make it bigger? Come on. It wants to make me the same size, but I need it a little bigger. It is what it is. I'll be bigger than the article. But this is an article from NBC Miami talking about new sanctions against the Cuban government, the Cuban Revolution, announced by the Trump administration this week. The article is dated July 13th. Essentially, Marco Rubio's State Department, his ongoing war against his own people continues with new sanctions announced on key sectors of the Cuban economy. They are really trying everything they possibly can to target any possible way the Cuban government can generate income, can generate the money it needs to provide free healthcare, free education, subsidized housing, and a revolutionary project for the Cuban people. Like, the US is really trying to suffocate Cuba. And so the new entities being targeted include Cuba's Ministry of Tourism, Minter, several national energy companies, a major foreign trade group, a maritime transportation company known as GEMAR, which deals with like shipping containers that are sent to Cuba, which deals with trade that's like sent to ports in Cuba. Like, they are really trying to cut off Cuba in every possible way they can. Also, additional sanctions announced on a state-owned financial services firm that helps generate revenue for the Cuban government. And again, the intent of these sanctions is to target as many possible industries as possible to try to cut off every possible source of income to the Cuban government. And you know, when a government cannot get income, that government cannot carry out its basic duties. The duties of the government in the US empire, where I live, are to carry out war against its own citizens and go into other nations and kill and invade and steal as well. But the duties of a socialist government like Cuba has is to provide for the well-being of its citizens, to make sure that they have access to the things that they need to be healthy and to live well. And so when revenue is cut off to the Cuban government, that continues to be a direct attack on the Cuban people. They are trying to starve out the Cuban people. And the architect of this policy is a Cuban American, Marco Rubio, who has never been to Cuba, will fix his mouth about all the problems, all the failures of the Cuban Revolution, how much the Cuban people are suffering under the Cuban Revolution, how the blockade isn't actually hurting the Cuban people, it's just the Cuban government, but has never set foot on the island to see the impact of his own policies on his own goddamn people. When I tell you that US imperialism, US settler colonialism produces the most disgusting diasporas, let me tell you, you have to break away from like decades, centuries of conditioning to turn you against your own motherfucking people when you live here. It's so gross. It's so gross that a Cuban American is doing this. But again, even before Marco Rubio got in there, it was a bipartisan policy of the US government to deliberately target the Cuban people, the Cuban population, to try to attempt to create starvation and suffering, like the Mali Memorandum says, to get them to be frustrated, to get them to be discontented, and to get them to turn against their own revolutionary project. It has not worked so far in 60 years, and you can see that the State Department comes out with new sanctions every couple of weeks now because they're getting frustrated. They keep waiting for the Cuban Revolution to fall. The Cuban Revolution continues to innovate, continues to survive, continues to receive support from solidarity forces all over the world, and the US government cannot take it. And so in response, it escalates the collective punishment on the Cuban people. They are punishing 10 million people, 11 million people for the so-called crime of liberating themselves from US exploitation, from US colonization. It is horrifying. Someone putting in the chat a really a disgusting but illuminating quote from Rubio's biography, where he says, "I dream of marching an army into Havana." Like, he really has a fantasy about overthrowing socialism in Cuba and crowning himself like the new chief, what's the word I'm looking for? What's the leader of a plantation? The new overseer? Because they're never going to let him be all the way in charge. He's too brown. But they'll put him in like that middle role, like the overseer role, where he'll punish his own people and whip them. And in exchange, he gets like head pats from the real people in charge. Yeah, that's what he wants. And it's fucking pathetic. Excuse my language. I just get so grossed out I get so grossed out by this man and by the ways that imperialism and settler colonialism have conditioned so many colonized nations to turn against their own people. Like, we really, really, really have to engage in like a cultural revolution, in a class struggle, in an anti-imperialist struggle, in a national liberation struggle to unlearn that indoctrination. Otherwise, you're gonna wake up and be fucking Marco Rubio, starving your own people to death. Additional news in the U.S. war on Cuba, we had a Trump administration sit down. I don't know what media news platform it was, some capitalist media, but he was in an interview where he was asked about the claims that Cuba has obtained a number of drones from Iran and may be considering an attack on the United States. Hot bullshit, nonsense. But Trump basically said that in response to these lies, these obvious lies, that the U.S. is working to act if it's true, and we have evidence that it may be, and Cuba better not, because if they do, we'll go in there and we'll take care of it. So just like more saber rattling, targeting the Cuban Revolution based on completely made up narratives. Before it was Iranian drones, it was Russian drones. Before it was Russian drones, it was a Chinese military base. They keep just making up shit, like straight up making up shit that is easily confirmed as false and using that as a pretext to threaten to invade Cuba, to escalate economic attacks on Cuba. Before that, they had Havana syndrome, and it turned out to be their own test weapon. Like, it's just endless, continuous. And in addition to the Trump administration interview where he was addressing the lies about Iranian drones in Cuba, which also one thing I want to say is if Cuba had in fact purchased Iranian drones, that it's within their right to do that. The U.S. has no say on who Cuba engages in trade with. And as a matter of fact, there seems to be an expectation on the part of U.S. administrations that the U.S. can just continue to attempt to destabilize and harm Cuba and Cuban people, and that Cuba should just like take it quietly. But like if Cuba was to organize a defense, which they are, and that defense including Iranian drones or Russian drones or military bases or whatever, Cuba is within its right. Cuba has the right to do that. So I don't give a damn. It's not true, but they have the right. But in addition to that, there was also a CBS News report saying that Trump is examining military options against Cuba, the possibility of some kind of military intervention. Let me go back to the screen share so I can show y'all this article. But yeah, senior defense officials looking at Cuba military options. This article also came out this week, actually, I think yesterday, it looks like, where essentially Trump and senior U.S. officials were basically getting options for what a U.S. military invasion of Cuba could look like. You could say, it says it could include an army-led air assault involving thousands of U.S. soldiers carried out by the 101st Airborne Division, the only unit trained for such a task, according to multiple U.S. officials with knowledge of the discussions. They always do this. Like, the intent of this article is to attempt to create panic among the Cuban population and also to attempt to manufacture consent for U.S. military intervention in Cuba among the U.S. public. But in this same article, it says that because so much of the U.S. military's resources are tied up currently in losing the war to Iran that the U.S. started, they are losing the war that they started, that it's unlikely that this is actually going to happen. So yeah, it's just like saber rattling. It's just ways to attempt to manipulate the narrative. It's a way to try to induce panic in the Cuban government, in the Cuban population, panic and fear. And it also is something that we have to take seriously in terms of organizing for the No War on Cuba campaign, but also take into account the geopolitical conditions, the reality that most of the U.S. military's resources are tied up in West Asia, losing the war to Iran, and keep hyper-focused on those economic attacks, because I do believe that those are the real play, and this is an attempt by the U.S. government, again, to manipulate the narrative. So I'll drop this article in the chat, and I highly recommend folks check it out so that we are working in a basis of facts. But again, it's the U.S. using like a media war, an economic war, and like the last remaining tool it has in the toolbox, the threat of violence, to attempt to get Cuba to do what it wants. But up until this point, even with the total oil blockade, even with new sanctions on different entities every single week, even with Trump threatening on national television to invade Cuba, even with CBS News, which at this point is a propaganda outlet of the Trump administration run by a straight up open Zionist, aka Nazi, is trying to poison the well and like spread a media narrative to scare Cuba, even in the face of all these different kinds of attacks being carried out by the U.S. against Cuba. The Cuban Revolution has not fallen. The Cuban Revolution has not panicked. The Cuban government continues to do what the Cuban people have organized it to do, which is to see Cuba through this escalating condition of attack and warfare successfully. So we should be clear-minded about what's actually happening and follow the model of the Cubans and not panic, because Trump is full of shit. Marco Rubio is full of shit. They are trying to scare us. They are trying to make us panic and mess up, and we cannot do that. Additionally, conditions on the ground in Cuba continue to deteriorate in response to these U.S. economic attacks. Cuba is unfortunately suffering the third national blackout. Its entire power grid is down in 2 weeks, and we have to continue to uplift that this is a direct consequence of U.S. policies attacking the Cuban people. They have been under a total oil blockade since January 26th. Not a drop of oil, except from oil from one Russian ship, has gone into Cuba since January 26th. That means that hospitals, elder care facilities, disabled people's homes, schools, ACs and refrigerators, and regular people's houses, all of these things cannot work. Phone service cannot work. Internet cannot work. We're about to take a brigade to Cuba in a little bit less than 2 weeks. And folks are like, am I going to be able to call my family? I have to check my email. And we're like, no. And this is because of U.S. policy. When the power grid goes down, when the whole island is blacked out, that means that basic life cannot continue. It is intense suffering, intense collective punishment, and is an intentional consequence, a direct consequence of U.S. policies attacking Cuba. When Marco Rubio fixes his mouth to say this is not an attack on the Cuban people, no, that is bullshit. It is nonsense. It is directly and intentionally targeting civilians. The lights are off in everybody's house. That is an attack on the civilians, and that is because of U.S. policy towards Cuba. So the No War on Cuba campaign must continue in the face of these escalating U.S. attacks. The next big action happening is the 24-hour global picket, which starts on July 25th at 12 p.m. Eastern. The National Network on Cuba is going to be bringing together Cuba solidarity forces from all over the world. We're reaching out to forces in the Caribbean, in South Africa, in West Africa, in Europe, in all over the world, cultural workers, organizers, artists who are going to be coming together on this live stream for 24 straight hours to act in solidarity with the Cuban Revolution, to call for an end to U.S. war on Cuba, and also to raise funds to bring material aid to Cuba. So please look out for more details about how you can participate, and block off your calendars. Block them off, hold it, so you can at least tune in for a couple of hours starting on July 25th at noon Eastern. Now, we're going to move to the main segment of the show, which is going to be an excerpt from the Brigadista Prep for the Centennial Fidel Brigade departing to Cuba on August 1st. And I'm going to bring back Comrade Ermia. Hello.
Hey, compas. Good to be here. Let's talk about this.
Yes. So, what the slides you see on the screen with us are slides taken directly from the first Brigadista prep session for the Brigadistas traveling to Cuba with the Venceremos Brigade and the National Network on Cuba for the Centennial Fidel Brigade. We have been doing a deep dive into the revolutionary lessons and legacies of Fidel Castro to prepare folks to go to Cuba with us. And this particular presentation is discussing internationalism as an intentional strategy of the Cuban Revolution. So what internationalism is Che Guevara called it solidarity of the weak. And I love that. It's essentially all of the nations who are suffering under the boot of imperialism and colonization, realizing that we are stronger if we come together. That's what that is. Internationalism is a commitment in action to anti-imperialism and anti-colonialism. It is understanding that we are all engaged in an interconnected struggle against the same enemy. I feel like that example of the US Navy chasing after Spain and sinking their ships and then usurping the three different national liberation struggles, the Filipino national liberation struggle, the Puerto Rican national liberation struggle, and the Cuban national liberation struggle at the same time, is like a really clear example of that. First, those three nations were colonized by Spain, and then the US swooped in there, cut off their independence movements, and took over, it really shows you it's the same entities giving us hell all over the world. And when it comes to actually, let me not go into that tangent because Maria has to talk to you. But essentially, it's recognizing that our fight is interconnected, and we are stronger if we fight side by side, if we coordinate across borders, if we support each other's struggles for self-determination, for dignity, and for sovereignty. The Cuban Revolution in particular, and Fidel Castro understood that internationalism was both a moral duty of the Cuban Revolution, as in it was the right thing to do to help other peoples liberate themselves in the same way that Cuba had, but they also understood it as a really important strategy to defend the Cuban Revolution itself. Cuba's internationalism has looked like military support for independence movements against colonization, against imperialism, also against apartheid all over the world. It has looked like sending doctors to help fight global pandemics, including Ebola and COVID-19. Cuban doctors have helped eradicate malaria in multiple African countries. Cuban doctors have also served as a primary source of medical treatment in many, many poor nations, including Honduras, where my family lives. And Cuban internationalism has also looked like material support, like literally sending weapons and resources to independence movements all over the world. Even in the face of the escalation of the US blockade on Cuba, the escalation of US economic and military and political attacks on Cuba, Cuban internationalism has not wavered. They continue to provide the support even as they are under attack. And it has offered a practical and symbolic path to liberation for the global South, and also proves that through revolutionary socialism, through scientific socialism, a poor nation can both provide for the material needs of its citizens and also project its power outwards in progressive ways in order to advance struggles for justice all over the world. And so the last thing I'll say on this slide is I want to read this quote from Comandante Fidel Castro, where he says, "Without internationalism, the Cuban Revolution would not exist. The enemy that threatens Cuba is the same enemy that threatens everyone else." And it's just that simple. Next, Lord. So some more specific examples of what Cuban internationalism has looked like. Like I said, they have provided military support for national liberation movements all over the world, particularly in Africa. At the top of the show, we played a clip of Fidel Castro talking about why Cuba provided material support or political support for Angola's national liberation struggle, led by the MPLA against Portuguese colonialism, backed by all the forces of NATO. And he says in that speech that people could not understand why Cuba was making such a sacrifice when they weren't trying to like loot Angola. And he was like, y'all need to understand like this is the right thing to do, and we're fighting the same enemy. So Operation Carlotta, which happened from 1975 to 1991, was Cuba's 15-year-long solidarity mission to aid the MPLA in their successful fight against Portuguese colonialism in Angola. Cuba sent hundreds of thousands of troops, teachers, doctors to Angola to fight under the leadership, that's very important, under the leadership of the MPLA in order to wage this fight against Portuguese colonialism. One of the most successful battles of Operation Carlotta was known as the Battle of Puto Carnavale, where the Cuban military fought alongside the MPLA and revolutionary forces from other nations in Southern Africa and forced the apartheid government's military, the apartheid government in South Africa, the white settler government in South Africa, to retreat back to the hell they came from and surrender. So that is not the only time that Cuba has showed up for Africa. They've also helped support national liberation movements in Azania, the African people's name for South Africa, in the Congo, famously with Che Guevara. It didn't work out. They were not successful after the assassination of Patrice Lumumba, but they built important relationships all across the African continent, despite that failure, and were able to support national liberation movements as well in Guinea-Bissau, in Mozambique, in Namibia, in Tanzania, in the Turtle Island. They helped support people's movements in Grenada under the New Deal movement led by Maurice Bishop. They helped support the ongoing resistance to imperialism in Haiti. They helped in Jamaica. They've also sent doctors to aid poor working class African communities in Chicago and Harlem. And after Hurricane Katrina decimated the city of New Orleans under the George W. Bush administration, the Cuban government offered to send doctors in mobile hospitals to help with recovery efforts to save people's lives. And the Bush administration turned them down and let thousands of people die. So all over the world, Cuba has helped support poor and working class peoples, African peoples, and colonized peoples in our liberation struggles, in our resistance to imperialism, in our survival against capitalism. And Cuba has also suffered consequences for this unrelenting internationalism. In fact, they were first put on the State Department's list of state sponsors of terrorism under the Reagan administration back in the 80s for their support of, they were basically helping Central and South American nations resist US intervention that was leading to like massacres of indigenous people. Like the US was carrying out the so-called Cold War, which on the ground in Central and South America looked like anti-communist paramilitaries carrying out like war crimes and atrocities and genocides. And Cuba was help supporting the revolutionary forces that were trying to stop that. And in response, the Reagan administration put them on the state sponsors of terrorism list in order to escalate the economic attacks on Cuba to punish them for helping the resistance against genocide in Turtle Island. So yeah, wow. So let me see. They sent their best doctors, educators, and combatants all over the world. They helped support global literacy campaigns. Cuba had its own literacy campaign, and they shared that with the rest of the world. They have sent medical brigades into pandemics, into war zones to help support people. And they have also sent troops, training, and weapons to support national liberation struggles. 10 million people have learned how to write. 600,000 Cuban medical personnel have served in 164 countries. More than 300,000 Cubans have served in Africa. 2,000 died in Operation Milagro. 3 million people regained eyesight. So Cuba doesn't need gold or minerals from Africa. It knows that freedom is tied to the freedom of the peoples of the African continent. That's again a quote from Fidel Castro's speech about why Cuba supported Angola. And now for the next part of this presentation, I believe I am passing it to Amia.
Thank you, Comrade Donier. Comrades, as we get into this next section of the presentation, I want us to think about the fact that when we think about the survival of the Cuban Revolution, it's easy for us to focus on events within Cuba itself, right? Economic reforms, domestic politics, or the decades-long genocidal embargo. But the Cuban Revolution isn't isolated. Its strongest survival force has always been internationalism. And Cuba is certain and strong in their conviction that socialism cannot exist in isolation. A small island that has been under economic blockade cannot endure alone. Instead, it must build relationships based on solidarity, mutual development, and shared struggle. These international relationships have allowed Cuba to preserve the revolution politically, economically, and ideologically, despite extraordinary external pressures by the so-called Yankees. And to understand why this strategy became necessary, we first need to recognize the scale of this pressure that is being put on Cuba in the Cuban Revolution. We have some of these numbers up here on the slide. But between March 2024 and February 2025 alone, Cuba estimated that the US blockade has caused approximately 7.5 billion US dollars in economic losses. This is just in 1 year alone. And to tell you kind of like the magnitude of the scale, that is roughly $20.7 million every single day in that 1 year. So these losses affect virtually every sector of Cuban society, right? From healthcare and transportation to food imports, finance, and scientific developments. The blockade is not simply a bilateral dispute. It is designed to isolate Cuba from the global economic system. And this is where internationalism becomes essential, right? By building political and economic partnerships, Cuba reduces the effectiveness of attempts to isolate it internationally. And rather than accepting exclusion, Cuba has actively constructed alternative networks of solidarity. One of the clearest examples, actually, is the Bolivarian Alliance for the Peoples of Our America. We talked about, of course, the strong solidarity that exists between Venezuela and Cuba. Well, I think this is a primary example of how that's turned into material support, right? Through its partnership with Venezuela, Cuba exchanged medical expertise, educational programs, technological assistance in return for much needed oil supplies that Cuba was needing. These arrangements also extended beyond healthcare into planning, HIV treatment, literacy campaigns, education, and more. And what's important here is that these relationships were not traditional aid programs. They were based on a mutual exchange. Cuba contributed what it had in abundance, which is highly trained professionals, especially doctors, nurses, teachers, public health experts, you name it. And its partners contributed resources that Cuba desperately needed in return, particularly energy and trade opportunities. So these exchanges created a model of shared development rather than a model of dependency, right? And the partnerships represented an alternative vision of international relations. And I want to make this point very clear, a threat to US hegemony who thought it could have a firm grip on Cuba's trade. But Cuba's internationalism is not only about economics. It has also a powerful ideological purpose, political discipline, right? For decades, Cuba has faced sustained campaigns portraying the revolution as a failed or isolated project. But internationalist missions directly challenged these Yankee, American, Washington, D.C. narratives. When Cuban doctors responded to healthcare crises across Latin America, Africa, Asia, and even parts of Europe, and also, like Comrade Oni mentioned, even here in America, right? One of the biggest people who wanted to provide support for Katrina victims were, in fact, the Cubans. They demonstrated something difficult to dismiss, which is, despite decades of a blockade, a small socialist country could produce world-class medical professionals and deliver healthcare where wealthier nations had completely failed. These missions generated enormous moral and political support for Cuba. They proved that Cuba was not simply surviving, it was actively contributing to global well-being, to the global well-being of humanity. And each medical brigade, each literacy campaign or educational exchange became evidence that another model of international cooperation was in fact possible. And these efforts also helped raise a political consciousness, right, internationally as well. Rather than viewing development as charity flowing from wealthy countries to poorer ones, Cuba emphasized mutual solidarity among nations facing similar histories of colonialism and imperialism. So in this sense, internationalism became both practical and politically educational. It taught that collective struggle could become the basis for development rather than US hegemony. And internationalism also strengthened the revolution at home, right? It wasn't just abroad, but also the developments in Cuba. International missions became a source of professional development for Cuban doctors, nurses, engineers, other specialists. Working in different countries exposed these professionals to new medical challenges, new technologies, new forms of community organization. These experiences enriched Cuba's own institutions when participants returned home. Serving abroad became a form of revolutionary discipline, right, for the Cuban people, a practical expression of socialism. Socialism literally materialized in real time. This reinforced the values that the revolution sought to cultivate from the jump. From the moment Fidel won the revolution, stepped foot into the jungles of Cuba, these are exactly the values that they were looking to embody and develop within their society. Cuba's international medical missions, I also want to make this note, has generated foreign revenue that has helped sustain universal healthcare at home, right? This is especially significant because despite severe economic hardship, Cuba has never abandoned its commitment to universal access to healthcare. So we have to understand that a country that is under survival is still providing some of the most incredible healthcare in the world. And this is the same thing with the students who come all over the world to study medicine in Cuba for free as well, right? These students return to their home countries with professional skills, yes, but they also leave they also leave with personal connections to Cuba. I mean, whenever we visited Cuba, right, and we visited ELAM, for those of you who don't know, ELAM is the Latin American School of Medicine. They literally say any student who accepts admission into the school has to promise that when they return to their communities, return to their home countries, that they will serve their communities. They will use their medical education to then put forth and materialize the values of the Cuban Revolution. So in other words, internationalism was not separate from Cuba's domestic welfare. These relationships created an apparatus of solidarity. Internationalism has never been an optional feature of the Cuban Revolution. It has been one of its central survival mechanisms. And Comrade, I think you can actually go to the next slide. And I think even for our enemies, right, it is difficult to deny that internationalism has played a critical role in preserving the revolution under conditions that believed would force its collapse, right? So they're constantly talking about the revolution failing and the revolution collapsing. Well, I think the internationalism that Cuba has portrayed has completely shown contrary to that, right? And so when we ask how the Cuban Revolution has endured for more than 6 decades, despite blockade, despite sanctions, despite sustained external pressures from the Yankee terrorists, part of the answer lies actually beyond the Cuban borders. For Cuba, internationalism has never been about foreign policy. It has always been a strategy of resistance, a model of development, and ultimately a means of preserving the revolution itself, right? The revolution, the Cuban Revolution, is in fact an internationalist one. And that's how the Cuban people are keeping their revolution alive, their socialism alive. So anyways, now I'm just on a tangent. So Comrade Onya, passing it back to you to talk about the organizations in the US who are also building the solidarity.
Okay, also you can always go on a tangent. That was amazing. But some organizations, want to highlight the title of this slide and shout out to Anna from the Centennial Fidel Responsibility team for putting together these slides. The slides we did last week were from Day, also from the Centennial Fidel Brigade Responsibility team. Just want to highlight the hitters, the ideological titans that we have among our organizing team. It's not just me and Ermia. So we break the blockade. That is the ultimate purpose of the Cuba Solidarity organizing that the Venceremos Brigade and the National Network on Cuba engage in, that we understand that the government that we pay taxes to, we live in the belly of the beast, is engaged in this genocidal war against the Cuban people. And we are not just going to stand by and watch that happen. We are not going to let that pass in silence. We are going to take organized and collective action with our bodies, with our funds, with our communities to oppose U.S. genocidal policy targeting the Cuban Revolution. So the Venceremos Brigade is the oldest U.S. Cuba Solidarity delegation in the United States. We have been traveling to Cuba since 1969, 10 years after the military victory of the Cuban Revolution against the Batista government. The very first Venceremos Brigade was like 300 people who sailed on 3 weeks on a shipping barge. They were on a boat for 3 weeks to get to Cuba because at that time, all travel between the United States and Cuba was illegal, violating the U.S. Constitution, as the ruling class tends to do. That very first Venceremos Brigade harvested sugarcane alongside Cuban workers and Fidel Castro himself, attempting to help them hit a sugar quota shortly after the United States refused to buy Cuban sugar and Cuba had to pursue other markets. The Venceremos Brigade has always been diverse in background. That very first VB was organized by members of Students for a Democratic Society. They had organized with the Young Lords, with the Black Panther Party, with the Chicano National Liberation Movement. Like, we were diverse. We were like a rainbow coalition in the Fred Hampton sense on that very first Venceremos Brigade. Diverse in race, diverse in age, diverse in gender, diverse in sexuality, united in our opposition to U.S. policy against Cuba and wanting to take action to do so. Many of those first brigadistas were made up of young folks. We are multi-generational in the present day. The current Venceremos Brigade organizing team includes folks from the 3rd VB, from the 2nd VB, from the very first VB, and also from like the 50th. That's where I came in, and all brigades in between, because we want to unite generations of anti-imperialist organizers in the imperialist core. The Venceremos Brigade is an anti-imperialist act of direct action in opposition to the U.S. blockade on Cuba. It is not spring break. It is not a tourist trip. It is a solidarity delegation, an anti-imperialist direct action where we are using our bodies to break the blockade. We travel around the island. We learn about the Cuban Revolution directly from the Cuban people. And then we come back and we keep organizing for Cuba. The VB has brought over 10,000 people from the United States to Cuba in the 50 plus years that we have been operating, and we will not stop no matter what attack Marco Rubio or Trump or Biden or whoever, Hillary Clinton, whomsoever, no matter what they dream up, we are not going to stop bringing people to Cuba until that blockade falls, period. And even after that, we're still going to go because we love the Cuban people and we love the Cuban Revolution. So we have been defying U.S. imposed travel restrictions on travel to Cuba for our entire existence. Like I mentioned, travel between the U.S. and Cuba used to be illegal in violation of the U.S. Constitution, and organizations like the Venceremos Brigade, like IFCO, Pastors for Peace, like Global Exchange, and many others engaged in what we call travel challenges to bring people to Cuba regardless in any way that we could, in order, again, to take direct action against unjust U.S. policies. And it was, in fact, the reality was that we brought so many people to Cuba so often that it became unenforceable for the U.S. government. And that is the main reason why travel between the U.S. and Cuba is legal now. Not because the U.S. government suddenly realized it was messed up to restrict who we could be friends with or where we could go, but because we made that shit unenforceable because we were relentless. We took thousands of people. Like, I actually want to drop the travel timeline that shows like the history of the fight for the right to travel, because it's like very educational, but I also find it very funny. Like how, like all the different things that the US government tried, and we were just like, we're still gonna go. We're still going. And we brought literally thousands of people. So I'm gonna put this in the chat right now. And I can't, for some reason I have trouble talking and typing. So we have engaged in this process of direct action against imperialism. We have brought thousands of people to Cuba. We have also engaged in a continuous process of exchange with the Cuban people. We are learning directly about how a revolutionary project is built and survives under constant attack. We are also sharing with the Cubans about our own struggles for liberation within the belly of the bees. Like, we had the African National Liberation Struggle on that first brigade, the Puerto Rican National Liberation Struggle, the Chicano National Liberation Struggle. They were harvesting sugarcane, not just alongside Cubans, but alongside like Vietnamese, members of the Vietnamese National Liberation Struggle, and from people from all over the world. And so from the very beginning, the brigadistas of the Venceremos Brigades have been engaged in a process of revolutionary exchange with the Cuban people, with the Cuban masses, sharing strategies, sharing lessons, sharing histories about how we can strengthen our resistance to imperialism across borders. The principles of the Venceremos Brigade include a commitment to collectivism, a commitment to transformative justice, understanding that if we believe in revolution as a process to transform a whole society, then we must believe that we as individuals can be transformed in the same way, even when we cause harm, even when conflict breaks out, and conflict do be breaking out on brigades, but we work through it with the revolutionary principles of transformative justice. So all of that is built into the fabric and culture of the VB. The VB is also a founding member organization of the National Network on Cuba. I am one of the 5 elected co-chairs of the National Network on Cuba, or Mia is the ACC media lead of the National Network on Cuba. It is a network started in 1991 of over 70 organizations across the United States and its colonies, because Puerto Rico is not part of the United States. Puerto Rico is a victim of the United States, a colony of the United States. And we do have Puerto Rican organizations who are united in our opposition to US policy attacking Cuban people, attacking the Cuban Revolution. The purpose of the National Network on Cuba is to combat the continuous imperialist propaganda, the media lies and warfare against Cuba, and also to build public pressure against the U.S. blockade on Cuba. We are seeking to organize communities and organizations all across the United States and beyond to oppose U.S. policy towards Cuba, to call for the end of the blockade, and also to build international solidarity with U.S. Cuba Solidarity Forces, Puerto Rico Solidarity Forces, and other international forces who are opposing U.S. policy towards Cuba. We promote exchange with the Cuban people in solidarity brigades, like not just the VB, but also the Mayday Brigade that happens every year that's organized by the National Network on Cuba, specifically the U.S. contingent. Also the Pastors for Peace delegations, also the Hot to Way Project delegations, Global Exchange delegations. So many people are traveling to Cuba constantly, and many of them work actively with the National Network on Cuba. And we are continuously engaged in coalition building. We are trying to bring more and more and more different kinds of organizations and communities into this work. We need a broad, militant, and organized Cuba Solidarity movement in order to break the blockade. The National Network on Cuba engages in on-the-ground local organizing via our Action for Cuba committees that are emerged from that Mayday Brigade and now exist all over the United States. And the National Network on Cuba is an anchor for the international No War on Cuba campaign that actually bloomed from the last Mayday Brigade. Armia was there. Armia was there at the beginning of the No War on Cuba campaign. It came from those brigades. Those brigades, no matter who organizes them, are such an important source of like new energy, new capacity. Like they really bring so many people into the Cuba Solidarity movement and the broader anti-imperialist struggle. So shout out to the brigades. And also you can learn more about the No War on Cuba campaign at the campaign website, nowaroncuba.com. It is a global movement being anchored by the NNOC. So just to conclude, the Venceremos Brigade and the National Network on Cuba are united in our support for Cuba's right to self-determination and sovereignty, and our opposition to U.S. policy attempting to collectively punish the Cuban people for liberating themselves and building a different way of being, building socialism. Like the whole world does not have to submit to capitalism. The shit is not working. It's truly not working. Like I was like reading a meme, like a tweet talking about like current conditions in the United States. And they were like, oh, we have explosive diarrhea. The air is filled with smoke across the Midwest and the US South. There's like a heat dome over the rest of the United States. Like there's like, it's a hot, like the president is having UFC fights and accusing China with no evidence of engaging. It's like a hot mess. It's a hot mess. So y'all are telling us this is the best we can do. Oh my God, no, let's try something else. Let's try socialism. The intent of the VB and the NNOC are also to connect the Cuba Solidarity movement to broader anti-imperialist struggles. Remember, internationalism is solidarity of the weak. We are fighting the same enemy on many different fronts. The same forces carrying out the genocide in occupied Palestine are the same forces blockading and sanctioning Cuba and drone bombing hospitals and schools in Iran. It's the same people giving us hell all over the world, which means it's the same struggle, which means that we have to connect across struggles and across borders. Sometimes that's controversial, but we're going to do it regardless while keeping Cuba at the center. We also want to build a resilient front in the face of U.S. imperialism in the imperial core, because let me tell you, the rest of the world is making it happen. The rest of the world is liberating itself from imperialism, coming together to form alternatives like BRICS, the Confederation of the Alliance of Sahel States, are saying that we need to figure out how to build alternatives outside of U.S. hegemony. So they're moving. Those of us inside the United States, like we have to move as well. And we're getting there. We're getting there. Like the mass resistance to the genocide in Gaza, the mass working class consciousness that is emerging increasingly, like all of those things are positive signs of the development of the resistance to imperialism within the belly of the beast. But we do have a ways to go, and the NNOC and the VB play a very important role. The Cuba Solidarity Movement plays a very important role. It's a point of entry for a lot of people. So we have to recognize the role that we play in building the resistance to imperialism within the United States. We are also fighting to build solidarity across liberation movements globally. That No War on Cuba campaign, once again, is a global movement initiated by a meeting of international delegations during the last Mayday Brigade, where folks were like, the war on Cuba is escalating. All resistance must escalate too. It must cross borders. We must be more coordinated. We must be more organizing. So that is what No War on Cuba is about. We have to build solidarity across the world. That is the scope of the movement that is needed to do what we need to do. And our work intensifies when we come back from these brigades. They are a point of entry that help funnel people into active Cuba Solidarity organizing, whether it's in the VBs, local committees, which is our local organizing arm, or whether it's the Action for Cuba committees of the National Network on Cuba. It is a way that the folks who are activated by the brigades can go back home and continue to fight for Cuba in a way that is unified and collective. So shout out to the VB, to the Mayday Brigade, to IFCO Pastors for Peace, to Global Exchange, and to all the volunteer brigades engaged in this important solidarity work with Cuba. Shout out to the VB and the Mayday Brigade for being led by youth, baby. African, indigenous folks, queer, and trans folks. We are unapologetically internationalists. We are engaged in revolutionary exchange. We are learning how to struggle together. We are engaged in a process of collective transformation, and we are building a principled commitment to international solidarity. So that's a little bit about the VB and the NNOC and how we are the US expression of Cuba's revolutionary internationalist strategy. Now we are done with the slides. And so I'm going to pass it back to Ermia, but let me set it up properly first to close us out. Hold on. So I'm going to put you there, and then I'm going to hide myself.
Awesome. All right. Well, compas, thank you for watching today's show. To close it out, we have a couple of action items, so please don't log off just yet. As my good compa Onye mentioned, the Centennial of Fidel Brigade is happening next month, early August. Literally August 1st is when the comrades are set to go to Cuba. And we are still needing donations for supplies to help people get there. Essentially, we need as much help as we can get. So please, please, please consider donating or sharing this link to folks who you think would be interested. Put it in your Instagram bio, put it on your Instagram stories, make a post about it, tag us. We are needing as much help as we can get to get as many people to Cuba and as much support, material support to Cuba as possible. Also, the IFCO is sending shipping containers of aid to Cuba. They have a goal of sending 60,000 pounds of aid to Cuba. They also have a donation link that we will be putting in the chat, and they've met their goal of 50,000 is what it says on the donation link. But of course, 60,000 pounds of aid is a lot. So we hope that you can donate to them as well. And then, of course, as Comrade Oni mentioned at the top of the show, the 24-hour picket is scheduled for next week, July 25th, which is next Saturday. So we encourage all of our partners, all of our friends, all of the people who are in solidarity with Cuba to refrain from using social media platforms and to stay up to date with the programming that we have that we'll be posting on our pages, and to get involved and be a part of this movement. So thank you everyone for watching. On next week's show, the girls are going to continue talking about the legacy of Comandante Fidel and what it is that we have learned from him. And comrades, when we say we are going to beat the Yankee terrorists, they're going to retreat, they're going to be removed from the global south, removed from our homelands, we mean it. So we say, yo solo sé tres palabras en inglés. Yankee, go home. Yankee, go home. That's a chant from the Puerto Rican Liberation Movement. So thank you, comrades, for watching, and all power to the people.
Eran las 3 de la mañana, 3 de enero en el calendario. Caracas dormía tranquila bajo su manto diario, pero el cielo no trajo sol, trajo un ruido de metal, y en Fuerte Tiuna se rompió el silencio habitual. No fueron truenos de lluvia, fueron botas extranjeras que cruzaron sin permiso nuestras líneas y fronteras. La noticia corre como pólvora, la pantalla se congela. Se han llevado al presidente, hay fuego en Venezuela. Liberen a Nicolás, grita una parte del mapa, mientras la garra del norte su sentencia destapa. Dicen que va hacia el norte sobre el mar prisionero, en las entrañas de acero de un buque extranjero. nadie quede mudo. Hoy la historia se parte. Liberen a Maduro. Hoy en Moscú escuchas el eco en el Caribe. Si cae un socio, el equilibrio no sobrevive. Pekín levanta la vista, el dragón debe mirar que las flotas del imperio han vuelto a navegar. Hermano en La Habana, sandinista en Nicaragua, saben que esta misma lluvia mañana será su agua. Si hoy tocan a uno y lo sacan de su cama, mañana su justicia incendiará toda la rama. Dicen que el Iwo Jima navega con la presa, que van rumbo a Nueva York a servirlo en la mesa. Trump firma la orden, Petro mira con espanto. ¿Es justicia o es venganza lo que cubre con su manto? Las bombas en la Carlota dejaron su marca en el suelo. Un pájaro de hierro se lo llevó en pleno vuelo. Para el que celebra en Miami, para el que llora en el barrio, esto no es solo un hombre, es un cambio de escenario. La soberanía sangra cuando el juez es el verdugo y la libertad no nace bajo la sombra del yugo. Venezolano, despierta, sea cual sea tu color. Hoy tu tierra fue pisada por la bota del invasor. El mundo aguanta la respiración, la moneda está en el aire. Nadie sabe el costo, nadie sabe el desaire. Desde el sur hasta el oriente,